Tonight, on Gay Timeline, we are turning back the clock to 1880, New York City. Gas lamps flicker against wet cobblestones. Horse-drawn carriages rattle past tenements where 15 people sleep in 3 rooms. And somewhere in the basement of a nondescript building on the Bowery, steam rises from copper tubs while men who have no word for what they are slip naked into the water together. They had no word for what they were, but they had each other, and tonight we say their names out loud, because they could not. I am Julian. This is Gay Timeline. In February of 1880, on a freezing Thursday night, a 23-year-old clerk named Thomas Byrne walked into a bathhouse on East 3rd Street with his coat collar turned up and his hat pulled low. He had walked past the place 6 times over the previous month. Each time, he told himself he was only curious. Each time, he kept walking. Tonight, he went inside. The entrance was narrow, a single door between a pawn shop and a German beer hall. No sign. If you did not know what the place was, you would walk right past it. Thomas knew. Everyone knew. The whole neighborhood knew that certain men went into that basement and came out 2 hours later smelling of soap and something else. Something the newspapers called depravity. Something Thomas had been thinking about every night for the last 6 weeks. He paid 15 cents to a man at the door who did not ask his name. The man pointed down a flight of wooden stairs. Thomas descended into warmth and steam and the smell of lye soap and wet tile. He could hear water sloshing, low voices, laughter that sounded like a secret being shared. At the bottom of the stairs, he stood in a narrow hallway lit by 2 gas lamps. To his left, a door. To his right, another door. Straight ahead, a third. He had no idea which one to choose. A hand touched his shoulder. Thomas spun around. The man standing behind him was older, maybe 40, with a thick moustache and kind eyes. He smiled. He said, "First time?" Thomas nodded. The man said, "Come on. I will show you." To understand why Thomas Byrne felt both terrified and exhilarated standing in that hallway, you have to understand something about New York in 1880 that most history books refuse to explain. The city had no word for gay, no word for homosexual. That term would not enter American English for another 12 years. There was no identity, no community in the way we think of community now. There were only acts. And the acts had been happening in the same handful of places for decades. If you find yourself drawn into this story, the like and subscribe buttons are there for you. But only if this is genuinely your kind of evening. And let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from and what time it is for you. It is always fascinating to see who is joining us from around the world. Now, let us go back to Thomas, standing in that hallway, about to step into a world that was never supposed to exist. For most of history, men like Thomas were alone. They loved in rooms no one would visit. They wrote nothing down. They left no trace. Tonight, we keep them company. That is all sleep needs to be. A quiet act of refusing to let someone be forgotten. By the end of tonight, you will know exactly what happened inside these bathhouses, why the police raided them but never shut them down, and what Thomas Byrne's name appeared beside in the arrest records of 1882. The man with the moustache led Thomas through the door on the left. They entered a long room lined with copper bathtubs. Steam hung in the air like fog. The ceiling was low. The walls were whitewashed brick, slick with condensation. There were 12 tubs, each one large enough for 2 men, though most held only 1. Some of the tubs were occupied. Some were empty. The water in each tub was cloudy with soap. The light was dim. Everything smelled like wet skin and sulfur and something else, something animal. Thomas stood very still. The man with the mustache said, "You can take any empty tub, or you can share. Most men share." He smiled again. "I am Frank. If you need anything, I will be in the 3rd tub from the end." Then he walked away. Thomas stood alone for what felt like an hour, but was probably 30 seconds. His heart was pounding. His hands were shaking. He had come this far. He could leave. He could turn around, walk back up those stairs, go home to his boarding house room, and pretend this never happened. He could do that. He did not do that. He walked to an empty tub near the back of the room. He started to undress. There were hooks on the wall for clothes. No lockers, no privacy curtain, just hooks. Thomas hung his coat, his jacket, his vest, his shirt. He unlaced his boots. He peeled off his socks. He hesitated at his trousers. Then he took those off too, and his undergarments, everything. Until he was standing naked in a basement in New York City, surrounded by strangers who were also naked. In 1880, he climbed into the tub. The water was hot, almost scalding. He sank down until it reached his shoulders. His skin prickled, his muscles unclenched. He leaned his head back against the copper rim and closed his eyes, and for the first time in 6 weeks, he let himself breathe. He stayed like that for maybe 5 minutes. Then someone said, "Mind if I join you?" Thomas opened his eyes. Standing beside the tub was a young man, 25 maybe, dark hair, slender build, naked. He was smiling the way someone smiles when they already know the answer, but are polite enough to ask the question anyway. Thomas said, "No, I do not mind." The young man climbed into the tub. They sat across from each other in water that was now slightly less hot, slightly more crowded, and infinitely more dangerous. The young man's knee brushed against Thomas's shin. It stayed there. Neither of them moved. The young man said, "I have not seen you here before." Thomas said, "It is my first time." The young man said, "I know." They sat in silence. The water sloshed gently. Somewhere in the room, 2 men were laughing. Somewhere else, someone was singing quietly in German. The gas lamps flickered. The steam made everything soft and blurry and unreal. The young man leaned forward. His knee pressed harder against Thomas's leg. He said, "My name is Arthur." Thomas said, "I am Thomas." Arthur smiled. He said, "It is nice to meet you, Thomas." And then Arthur's hand moved under the water. What happened next is not described in any police record. It is not written down. There is no documentation. But we know it happened. We know because Thomas came back. He came back the following Thursday, and the Thursday after that, and every Thursday for the next 2 years. We know because when the police finally raided the bathhouse in 1882, Thomas Burns' name appeared in the arrest ledger alongside Arthur Connell, charged with the crime of being found in a known resort for sodomites. But that night in February of 1880, none of that had happened yet. That night, Thomas and Arthur sat in a copper tub in the basement of a building on East 3rd Street, and for the first time in his life, Thomas was not alone. He had found his people. Now, let me tell you who those people were. The Bathhouses of Gilded Age, New York were not accidental. They were not spontaneous. They were built on purpose, run for profit, and patronized by a specific subset of the city's male population who knew exactly what they were walking into. Some of these men were clerks, like Thomas. Some were laborers. Some were shopkeepers. A few were wealthy. Most were not. What they all had in common was this: they desired other men, and they had nowhere else to go. New York in 1880 was a city of 1 million people crammed onto an island 12 miles long. Housing was scarce. Privacy was non-existent. If you were a working-class man, you lived in a boarding house. You shared a room with 2 or 3 other men. You shared a bed with at least one of them, not because you wanted to, because that was the only option. You had no space of your own, no door that locked, no place to bring someone even if you wanted to. The city was suffocatingly public, except in certain places. The bathhouses were one of those places. They started as legitimate businesses. Public bathing was common in the 1870s and 1880s because most tenement buildings had no running water. If you wanted a hot bath, you went to a bathhouse. You paid your 15 cents. You soaked. You left. Simple. But some bathhouses started to develop reputations. The one on East 3rd Street was called the Lafayette. The one on the Bowery near Houston was called the Metropolitan. There was one on West Street near the docks. There was one on Allen Street in the Lower East Side. By 1880, there were at least a dozen scattered across Manhattan, and every one of them was known in certain circles as a place where men could meet other men. The owners knew. They absolutely knew. Some of them were indifferent. Some of them were participants. A few were profiteers who charged extra for privacy or looked the other way when the tubs got crowded. The police knew too. Everyone knew. And for a while, no one did anything about it. The reason no one did anything is complicated. It has to do with class. It has to do with visibility. It has to do with the fact that in 1880, American society had not yet decided that men desiring men was a distinct category of person. It was still just an act. A sin, yes. A crime, technically, but not an identity. You were not a homosexual. You did a homosexual thing. The distinction mattered. If you were wealthy and discreet, you could do whatever you wanted behind closed doors, and society would politely ignore it. If you were poor and public, you got arrested. The bathhouses existed in a strange middle zone. They were public enough that the police could raid them anytime they wanted, but they were discreet enough that most of the time the police did not bother. The men who went there were not causing trouble. They were not soliciting on street corners. They were not bothering women. They were not visible. They paid their 15 cents. They went downstairs. They did what they did, and they left. As long as they stayed underground, the city let them exist, until someone decided to make an example. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Let us go back to Thomas. Over the next few months, Thomas became a regular at the Lafayette. He went every Thursday night. Sometimes he went on Saturdays too. He learned the unspoken rules. He learned which tubs were for bathing and which were for something else. He learned that the men in the front room were often just bathing, but the men in the back room were always looking. He learned how to read a glance, how to return a smile, how to move through the space like he belonged there. Because he did belong there. For the first time in his life, he was exactly where he was supposed to be. He saw Arthur most weeks. Sometimes they shared a tub. Sometimes Arthur was already with someone else, and they just nodded to each other across the room. It was not a romance. It was not love. It was something simpler and maybe more important. It was recognition. Arthur worked as a typesetter for a printing company. He lived in a boarding house on Rivington Street. He had a girlfriend. Her name was Mary. She thought Arthur was going to propose. He was not going to propose. But he let her think it because that was easier than explaining what he actually did on Thursday nights. Thomas did not have a girlfriend. He had tried once. Her name was Margaret. She worked in the same office building where Thomas clerked. They went on 3 walks together. She talked about her sister's wedding. Thomas nodded and smiled and felt nothing. After the 3rd walk, Margaret stopped speaking to him. Thomas was relieved. He did not want Margaret. He wanted Arthur, or someone like Arthur, or maybe just the feeling he got sitting in that tub with another man's leg pressed against his in the dark. One Thursday in April, Thomas arrived at the Lafayette and found the place more crowded than usual. Every tub was occupied. Men were standing along the walls, waiting for space to open up. The air was thick with steam and sweat, and the smell of too many bodies in too small a room. Thomas paid his 15 cents and went downstairs and stood in the hallway wondering if he should just leave. Frank appeared beside him, the same Frank from Thomas's first night. Frank said, "Busy tonight. There is a ship in. Sailors." Thomas said, "I can come back another night." Frank said, "Or you can go to the back room." Thomas had never been to the back room. He said, "What is in the back room?" Frank smiled. He said, "You will see." He led Thomas through a narrow door at the end of the hallway. They walked down another short corridor. Frank pushed open a second door. The back room was smaller, darker. There were no tubs, just a long wooden bench along one wall and a few chairs scattered around. 6 or 7 men were sitting or standing in the dim gaslight. One of them was Arthur. Thomas stopped in the doorway. Arthur looked up. He smiled. He said, "Thomas, come sit." Thomas sat beside Arthur on the bench. The room was quieter than the tub room. The men spoke in low voices. Some of them were smoking. One man in the corner was reading a newspaper. Another was mending a shirt. It looked, Thomas thought, like any other roomful of men on a Thursday night. Except it was not. Arthur leaned close. He said, "This is where we go when the tubs are full, or when we just want to talk." Thomas said, "Talk?" Arthur laughed. He said, "Yes, talk. We are not animals. Sometimes we just want to sit with people who understand." And that, Thomas realized, was exactly what this was. These men were not here for sex. Not tonight. They were here because everywhere else in the city they had to pretend. They had to perform. They had to be the man their landlord expected, the man their employer expected, the man their family expected. But here, in this basement, in this back room behind the tubs, they could stop pretending. They could sit. They could talk. They could exist. Someone told a joke. Everyone laughed. Someone else complained about his boss. Everyone nodded. A young man near the door said his mother was trying to set him up with a girl from church. Someone said, "Just marry her. It is easier." Someone else said, "Do not marry her. You will make her miserable." The young man said, "I know." Everyone was quiet for a moment. Then Frank said, "I was married once." Everyone looked at him. Frank said, "Lasted 2 years. She was a good woman. I was a terrible husband. I tried. I really did. But you can only pretend for so long." He took a drag on his cigarette. "She left me. Took the kids. I have not seen them in 8 years." No one said anything. Frank smiled sadly. He said, "But I am happier now. So there is that." Thomas sat on that bench and listened to these men talk about their lives, and he realized something. He was not alone. He had never been alone. There were hundreds of men like him in this city, maybe thousands. They worked beside him. They lived in the same buildings. They walked the same streets. And every week, they came here, to this basement, to these rooms, because this was the only place in all of New York where they could be themselves. Arthur put his hand on Thomas's knee. Thomas did not move it. They sat like that for an hour, just sitting, just being. When Thomas finally left that night, he walked home through streets that felt different. The city looked the same. The gas lamps, the horse manure, the noise. But Thomas was different. He had found something he did not know he was looking for. He had found a world. Now, let me tell you how that world was built. The bathhouses were not the only places where men met men in Gilded Age New York. There were theaters. There were certain saloons. There were parks. There were piers. There were alleys. There were public restrooms. Anywhere men gathered, some men found each other. But the bathhouses were special. They were enclosed. They were warm. They were, in their own strange way, safe. The men who ran these places were not activists. They were not crusaders. They were businessmen. Some of them were exploitative. Some charged exorbitant fees. Some blackmailed their customers. But some, like the man who owned the Lafayette, simply saw an opportunity and took it. There was demand. He supplied. Capitalism at its finest. The Lafayette was owned by a man named Samuel Rosen. He was Jewish. He was 46. He had emigrated from Prussia in 1868 and opened his first bathhouse in 1872 on Rivington Street. That one catered to the local immigrant population, men who wanted a hot bath, nothing more. It was a legitimate business. It made a small profit. In 1877, Rosen opened a second location on East 3rd Street. This one was different. Rosen had noticed that certain men kept coming back. They stayed longer. They paid extra for privacy. They tipped well. Rosen was not a fool. He understood what was happening. So he built the back room. He hired Frank to manage the place. Frank was discreet. Frank understood the clientele. Frank made sure the place stayed quiet. No fights, no noise, no trouble. If you caused trouble, Frank kicked you out, and you did not come back. The rules were simple. Be quiet. Be discreet. Pay your 15 cents. Everyone was welcome as long as they followed the rules. By 1880, the Lafayette was the most popular bathhouse of its kind in Lower Manhattan. It was also the most dangerous, because the more popular it became, the more visible it became. And visibility, for men like Thomas, was death. The police had raided bathhouses before. In 1876, a place on the Bowery was shut down after neighbors complained. In 1878, another one on West Street was raided and 12 men were arrested. But those raids were sporadic. They were reactive. Someone complained. The police acted. Then everyone forgot about it, and the bathhouses opened again under different names. But in 1881, something changed. A new district attorney took office. His name was John McKeon. He was a reformer. He was ambitious. He wanted to clean up New York. And one of the things he decided to clean up was vice. McKeon did not care about the bathhouses specifically. He cared about his career. He needed arrests. He needed headlines. He needed to look like he was doing something. The bathhouses were easy targets. In March of 1881, McKeon assigned a young officer named William Kipp to investigate known resorts for degenerates. Kipp was 28. He was eager. He wanted to make a name for himself. He started visiting the bathhouses undercover. He went to the Metropolitan first, then the one on Allen Street. Then, in May of 1881, he went to the Lafayette. Thomas was there that night. So was Arthur. Officer Kipp paid his 15 cents. He went downstairs. He walked into the tub room. He looked around. He saw exactly what he expected to see. Men in tubs, some alone, some together, some doing nothing. Some doing things that were illegal under New York's sodomy statute. Kipp took mental notes. He left. He went back to the precinct and wrote a report. 2 weeks later, the police raided the Lafayette. It was a Thursday night. Thomas had just arrived. He was in the hallway taking off his coat when the door at the top of the stairs burst open. 6 officers came down. They had clubs. They were shouting. Everyone froze. Frank stepped forward. He said, "There is no trouble here." One of the officers hit him in the stomach with a club. Frank fell. The officers started grabbing men. They pulled men out of tubs. They did not care if the men were dressed. They dragged them up the stairs in towels, in undergarments, in nothing. They arrested 23 men that night. Thomas was one of them. Arthur was another. They were taken to the Tombs, the city jail. They were booked. They were fingerprinted. Their names were written in a ledger. The charge was lewd and dissolute conduct. The penalty was up to 6 months in prison. Thomas spent 3 days in a cell with 5 other men before his case was heard. He did not sleep. He did not eat. He just sat on the stone floor and stared at the wall and wondered if his life was over. On the 3rd day, a lawyer appeared. His name was Abraham Hummel. He was famous. He defended gamblers, pickpockets, con artists, and men arrested in bathhouses. He worked fast. He worked cheap. He worked miracles. Hummel got 16 of the 23 men released on a technicality. The police had not obtained a proper warrant. The raid was illegal. The charges were dropped. Thomas walked out of the Tombs on a Saturday morning in late May. The sun was too bright. The air smelled like horse manure and river water and freedom. He went back to his boarding house. He packed his things. He moved to a different neighborhood. He never went back to the Lafayette. Arthur was not as lucky. Arthur's name appeared in the newspaper. The New York Tribune ran a small item. Arthur Connell, typesetter, arrested for sodomy. Arthur lost his job. His landlord evicted him. His girlfriend left him. He disappeared from the city. Thomas never saw him again. That is how it worked in 1880. You could be arrested. You could be ruined. You could lose everything. and the city would move on like you never existed. But here is the thing. The bathhouses did not close. The Lafayette reopened 3 months later under a new name. The men came back. New men arrived. The world Thomas had found in that basement kept turning, because you cannot arrest an entire community. You cannot jail a need. You cannot legislate away desire. The city tried. It failed. The bathhouses survived. And men like Thomas kept going downstairs. Thomas found work at a shipping company on South Street. He kept his head down. He did not talk to anyone about where he had been or what had happened. For 6 months, he lived like a ghost. He went to work. He went home. He ate in silence. He slept badly. He did not go near East 3rd Street. He did not go near any bathhouse. He told himself he was done with that life. He lasted until November. On a cold Wednesday night, Thomas walked past a building on Christie Street and saw a man descending a flight of steps into a basement. The man looked around before he went down. The gesture was familiar, furtive. Thomas knew that look. He had worn that look himself 100 times. He followed the man down the steps. The door at the bottom was unmarked. Thomas knocked. A slot opened. Eyes peered out. Thomas said, "I am here for a bath." The door opened. This place was smaller than the Lafayette. The hallway was narrower. The ceiling was lower. There were only 6 tubs instead of 12. But the smell was the same. Soap and steam and skin. The feeling was the same. Thomas paid his 15 cents to a woman at a small wooden desk. She did not ask his name. She pointed toward the tubs. Thomas undressed. He climbed into the water. He closed his eyes and felt the heat soak into his bones, and for the first time in 6 months he let himself breathe. A voice said, "You look like you needed that." Thomas opened his eyes. A man was sitting in the tub beside his. Mid-30s, broad shoulders, calloused hands, a face that had seen weather. He smiled. Thomas said, "I did." The man said, "I am Joseph." Thomas said, "I am Thomas." Joseph said, "Good to meet you, Thomas. You been here before?" Thomas said, "Not here. Somewhere else." Joseph nodded. He understood. He said, "They raided the place I used to go. Everyone's scattered. Took me 4 months to find this one." Thomas said, "The Lafayette?" Joseph's eyebrows went up. He said, "You were there?" Thomas said, "I was arrested." Joseph leaned forward. He said, "They let you go?" Thomas said, "Eventually." Joseph was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I am sorry. That must have been hell." Thomas said, "It was." Joseph said, "But you came back." Thomas said, "I came back." Joseph smiled. He said, "Good. We need men who come back. Most of them disappear. They get scared. They go back to pretending. But the ones who come back, they are the ones who survive." Thomas did not know if that was true. But sitting in that tub, listening to Joseph talk, he wanted it to be true. Joseph was a dock worker. He loaded ships on the East River. He had been coming to bathhouses for 8 years. He had been arrested twice, once in 1876, once in 1879. Both times he spent a week in the tombs and then the charges were dropped. He said the trick was to never give your real name. He said the police did not care who you actually were. They just wanted bodies to fill their arrest quota. If you gave a fake name, they could not find you later. They could not ruin you. Thomas said, "What name do you use?" Joseph grinned. He said, "Tonight I am Joseph. Last week I was John. Next week I might be William. Depends on my mood." Thomas said, "How do you remember?" Joseph said, "I do not. I just pick something simple and hope I do not forget it before the judge asks." They talked for an hour. Joseph told Thomas about the other bathhouses still operating. There was one on Bleecker Street, one near the Navy Yard in Brooklyn, one in the basement of a hotel on Broadway that catered to a wealthier crowd. Men in tailored suits, men with money. Joseph had been there once. He said it felt wrong, too clean, too polite. He preferred places like this, working men, real men, men who did not pretend to be anything other than what they were. Thomas understood. He came back the following week, and the week after that. By December, he was a regular. He learned the rhythms of the place. Wednesday nights were quiet. Fridays were crowded. Saturday afternoons brought a different crowd. Younger men. Men who worked in shops and had Saturday afternoons off. Men who could not risk being seen at night. Thomas met a man named Daniel who worked in a bakery. Daniel was 19. He had never been arrested. He had never even heard of a raid. He thought the bathhouses were safe. Thomas did not tell him otherwise. Let the boy have his innocence a little longer. He met a man named Robert who had been married for 12 years. Robert had 3 children. He loved his wife. He also loved men. He did not see the contradiction. He came to the bathhouse every other Friday. His wife thought he was playing cards. Robert said, "She is happier not knowing. I am happier having this. Everyone wins." Thomas was not sure that was true, but he did not argue. He met a man named Owen who spoke with an Irish accent and worked as a groom for a wealthy family uptown. Owen said the rich men did the same things poor men did. They just did it in nicer rooms. He said he had seen things in that house that would make a bathhouse look like Sunday church. Thomas believed him. These men became Thomas's world. Not friends exactly. You did not make friends in a bathhouse. You made acquaintances. You made connections. You shared space and water and sometimes touch, and then you went back to your separate lives. But it was enough. It was more than Thomas had ever had before. In January of 1882, the police raided the Christie Street bathhouse. Thomas was not there. He had worked late that night. By the time he arrived, the place was empty. The door was broken. The tubs were overturned. Water was everywhere. A neighbor told him the police had taken 11 men. Thomas did not ask for names. He did not want to know. He walked home slowly. The streets were icy. His breath made clouds in the cold air. He thought about Arthur. He thought about Joseph and Daniel and Robert and Owen. He thought about how fragile this all was, how easily it could be taken away. He thought about leaving New York. He did not leave. Instead, he found another bathhouse. This one was on Eldridge Street. It was even smaller. 4 tubs. A back room with a single bench. The owner was a German immigrant named Klaus, who spoke broken English and did not ask questions. Thomas went there twice a week. He kept his head down. He used a fake name. He told people he was a clerk. He did not tell them where he worked. He did not tell them where he lived. He learned to protect himself. By the spring of 1882, Thomas had been going to bathhouses for 2 years. He had been arrested once. He had watched places get raided and reopen. He had seen men disappear and new men arrive. He had learned that this world, this underground world of basements and steam and furtive glances, was both fragile and indestructible. The city could raid it. The police could arrest it. The newspapers could condemn it. But it would not go away, because the men who needed it had nowhere else to go. And then, Thomas met someone who changed everything. His name was Edward. Thomas met him on a Thursday in April. Thomas had just arrived at the Eldridge Street bathhouse. He was undressing when a man walked in carrying a leather satchel. The man was tall, thin, well-dressed. His coat was wool. His boots were polished. He looked, Thomas thought, like he had walked into the wrong building. The man paid his 15 cents. He set his satchel carefully on a bench. He began to undress with the precise movements of someone who had done this before. He hung his coat on a hook. He folded his vest. He placed his cufflinks in his jacket pocket. Then he turned and saw Thomas staring. He smiled. He said, "Do I have something on my face?" Thomas said, "No, sorry, I just was not expecting." The man said, "Someone like me?" Thomas said, "Yes." The man walked over. Up close, Thomas could see he was older than he first appeared. Maybe 35. Lines around his eyes, grey at his temples, but handsome, strikingly so. The man extended his hand. He said, "Edward Stevenson." Thomas shook it. He said, "Thomas Byrne." Edward said, "A pleasure, Thomas. Is this your first time here?" Thomas said, "No, I have been coming for a few months." Edward said, "Good. Then you can tell me if the water is worth the price." Thomas said, "It is hot." Edward laughed. He said, "That is all I need." They climbed into separate tubs. For a while, they did not speak. Thomas watched Edward out of the corner of his eye. Edward sat in the water with his head tilted back and his eyes closed. He looked relaxed. He looked like he belonged. After a while, Edward opened his eyes. He said, "You are staring again." Thomas said, "Sorry." Edward said, "Do not apologize, I am used to it." Thomas said, "You do not seem like the usual crowd." Edward said, "What does the usual crowd seem like?" Thomas said, "Working men, clerks, dock workers." Edward said, "And I seem like what? A gentleman?" Thomas said, "Yes." Edward smiled. He said, "Appearances can be deceiving. I work for a living just like you. I am a journalist." Thomas said, "What do you write about?" Edward said, "Whatever pays. Theatre reviews, crime reports, occasionally a scandal if it is juicy enough." Thomas said, "Have you written about the raids?" Edward's expression shifted. He looked at Thomas carefully. He said, "I have. Why?" Thomas said, "I was arrested last year, at the Lafayette." Edward sat up. He said, "You were one of the 23? Thomas said, "Yes." Edward said, "Did they convict you?" Thomas said, "No. The lawyer got most of us off. Technicality." Edward was quiet. Then he said, "I wrote about that raid. Small piece in the Herald. I called it a travesty." Thomas said, "You did?" Edward said, "The police have better things to do than arrest men for taking baths together. I said so in print." Thomas said, "What did your editor say?" Edward said, "He cut half of it, but he printed enough." Thomas stared at him. He said, "Why would you risk that?" Edward said, "Because someone has to." They talked for 2 hours. Edward told Thomas he had been coming to bathhouses for 15 years. He had been arrested 3 times. He had been beaten by police twice. He had lost jobs. He had lost friends. But he kept coming back. And he kept writing. Not under his own name, not always. But he wrote. He documented. He kept a record of the raids, the arrests, the men who disappeared. He said someone had to remember, because the city wanted to forget. Thomas said, "Why are you telling me this?" Edward said, "Because you came back. Most men do not. They get arrested and they disappear. They go back to their lives and they pretend this never happened. But you came back. That means something." Thomas said, "It means I am stupid." Edward said, "It means you are brave." Thomas did not feel brave. He felt scared. He felt like he was one raid away from losing everything. But sitting in that tub, listening to Edward talk, he felt something else too. He felt less alone. Edward became a regular part of Thomas's life. They met at the bathhouse every Thursday. Sometimes they just bathed. Sometimes they talked for hours. Edward told Thomas about the hidden history of men like them. He said it went back centuries. He said every city in the world had places like this: London, Paris, Berlin, Rome. Men had always found each other, and men had always been punished for it. Edward was writing a book. He would not say what it was about, but Thomas suspected. Edward carried notebooks everywhere. He wrote down names, dates, details. He interviewed men. He collected stories. Thomas asked him once what he planned to do with it all. Edward said, "Publish it, someday, when it is safe." Thomas said, "It will never be safe." Edward said, "Then I will publish it anyway." In June of 1882, the police raided the Eldridge Street bathhouse. Thomas was there. So was Edward. This time, Thomas did not freeze. He ran. He grabbed his clothes and ran up the back stairs Klaus had shown him months ago. Edward followed. They burst out into an alley behind the building. They could hear shouting, footsteps, whistles. They ran. They ran through alleys and side streets until they reached the Bowery. Then they slowed. They were both breathing hard. Edward was laughing. Thomas said, "What is funny?" Edward said, "I have been doing this for 15 years and I still get an incredible thrill from outrunning the police." Thomas said, "They are going to shut it down." Edward said, "They will try. It will reopen somewhere else." Thomas said, "How do you know?" Edward said, "Because it always does." They walked together to a tavern on Grand Street. They sat in the back. They ordered beer. They did not talk about what had just happened. They talked about the weather, about work, about nothing important, because talking about nothing important was the only way to process what had just happened without falling apart. Edward said, "Where will you go now?" Thomas said, "I do not know." Edward said, "There is a place in Brooklyn, near the Navy Yard. It is safer. The police do not raid it as often." Thomas said, "How do I find it?" Edward took out a notebook. He tore out a page. He wrote an address. He handed it to Thomas. He said, "Saturday nights. Ask for Walter. Tell him I sent you." Thomas took the paper. He said, "Thank you." Edward said, "We take care of our own. That is all we have." Thomas went to the Brooklyn bathhouse the following Saturday. It was in the basement of a warehouse. The entrance was through a loading dock. Inside, it was bigger than any place Thomas had been before. 10 tubs, 2 back rooms, a small bar that served beer and whiskey. The man at the door was named Walter. Thomas told him Edward sent him. Walter nodded. He said, "Edward is good people. 15 cents. Thomas paid. He went inside. The place was crowded, maybe 30 men, some in tubs, some standing around talking, some drinking. It felt different than the other bathhouses, less furtive, more open. Like the men here had decided they were not going to hide anymore. Thomas found an empty tub. He climbed in. The water was almost too hot. He sank down and closed his eyes. A voice said, "New here?" Thomas opened his eyes. A man was standing beside the tub. Young, maybe 22, red hair, freckles. He was smiling. Thomas said, "Yes." The man said, "I am Michael. Mind if I join you?" Thomas said, "Go ahead." Michael climbed in. He sat across from Thomas. He said, "How did you find this place?" Thomas said, "A friend told me." Michael said, "Good friend." They sat in silence for a while. Then Michael said, "I saw you looking around earlier, like you were expecting something bad to happen." Thomas said, "I have been raided before." Michael said, "How many times?" Thomas said, "Twice." Michael said, "I have been raided 4 times, arrested twice, convicted once." Thomas said, "What happened?" Michael said, 30 days on Blackwell's Island. It was hell, but I survived." He leaned forward. "And then I came back, because what else am I going to do? Pretend to be someone I am not for the rest of my life? No, thank you." Thomas said, "You are not afraid?" Michael said, "I am terrified. Every time I walk down those steps, I think this might be the time they catch me. This might be the time I do not get away. But I come anyway, because this is the only place I get to be myself." Thomas understood. He felt the same way. Michael said, "You should come on Sundays. Sunday afternoons are the best. Fewer people. More time to talk. We have a group, 10 or 12 of us. We meet here every week." Thomas said, "What do you talk about?" Michael said, "Everything. Our lives, our problems, how to stay safe, how to survive." He smiled. "Sometimes we just tell jokes. It is nice. You should join us." Thomas said, "Maybe I will." He did. The following Sunday, Thomas arrived at the Brooklyn bathhouse at 2 in the afternoon. Michael was there. So were 11 other men. They sat in the back room on benches, arranged in a rough circle. They talked for 3 hours about work, about families, about the constant fear of being discovered, about the small joys they managed to carve out in a world that wanted them erased. One man talked about his lover who had died the previous year, tuberculosis. He said no one knew they had been together. When the man died, his family took the body. They did not invite Thomas's friend to the funeral. They did not acknowledge he existed. The man cried while he talked. Everyone listened. No one looked away. Another man talked about his plan to move to San Francisco. He said he had heard there were more men like them out west, more freedom. He was saving money. He would leave by the end of the year. Everyone wished him luck. No one believed he would actually go. But it was nice to think about. A third man talked about a doctor he had met. A real medical doctor. The doctor had told him that what they felt was not a sickness. It was not a sin. It was simply the way some men were made. The man said he did not know if he believed that, but he wanted to. Thomas listened to all of this and felt something unfamiliar. He felt hope. Not hope that things would change. He was not naive. He knew the world was not going to accept them. But hope that he could survive anyway. Hope that he was not alone. Hope that there were others who understood. He went back every Sunday. By the fall of 1882, Thomas had found a kind of life. He worked. He went to the bathhouse. He saw Edward on Thursdays and Michael on Sundays. He had a small circle of people who knew him, really knew him. It was not much, but it was more than he had ever had, and then everything fell apart. In October of 1882, the district attorney launched a coordinated crackdown on vice in Lower Manhattan and Brooklyn. It was the largest operation of its kind. 27 locations raided in one night. Bathhouses, saloons, theaters, anywhere men were known to gather. Over 200 men arrested. The Brooklyn bathhouse was hit at 9 o'clock on a Saturday night. Thomas was not there. He had stayed home that night. He did not know why, just a feeling, instinct, luck. Michael was there. So was Edward. So were most of the men Thomas knew. They were all arrested. Thomas found out the following morning. A boy from the neighborhood knocked on his door. The boy said his brother had been arrested. He was looking for anyone who knew what to do. Thomas went with him to the precinct. The cells were full. Men packed in like animals. Thomas saw Michael through the bars. Michael's face was bruised. His shirt was torn. He saw Thomas and tried to smile. Thomas said, "Are you all right?" Michael said, "I have been better." Thomas said, "Where is Edward?" Michael pointed to another cell. Edward was sitting on the floor with his back against the wall. His glasses were broken. He had blood on his collar. But he was writing. He had somehow kept his notebook. He was documenting everything. Thomas tried to get them released. He went to Abraham Hummel's office. Hummel said he could help, but it would cost $50 per man. Thomas did not have $50. He did not have $5. He went back to the precinct. He told Michael he would find the money. Michael said, "Do not. Save yourself." Thomas said, "I am not leaving you here." Michael said, "You do not have a choice." The trials happened fast. Most of the men pleaded guilty. The judge gave them 30 days. Some got 60. A few got 6 months. Michael got 90 days because he had a prior conviction. Edward got 6 months because the police found his notebooks and decided he was organizing a ring of degenerates. Thomas visited Michael once on Blackwell's Island. It was worse than he imagined. The prison was overcrowded. The men slept on stone floors. They were fed once a day. Thin soup, stale bread. Michael had lost weight. He looked hollow. Thomas said, "I am sorry." Michael said, "Not your fault." Thomas said, "I should have been there." Michael said, "Then you would be here too. At least one of us is still free." Thomas never saw Edward again. Edward was released after 6 months, but he left New York. Someone said he went to Chicago. Someone else said Europe. Thomas did not know. Edward disappeared. His book was never published. Michael was released in January of 1883. Thomas met him at the prison gate. Michael looked like a different person, thinner, older, quieter. They walked together to the ferry. Michael did not talk. Thomas did not push. On the ferry, Michael finally spoke. He said, "I am done." Thomas said, "With what?" Michael said, "All of it, the bathhouses, the risk. I cannot do it anymore." Thomas said, "Where will you go?" Michael said, "I do not know. Somewhere else, somewhere I can disappear." Thomas said, "You do not have to disappear." Michael looked at him. He said, "Yes, I do. We all do. That is the only way to survive." Thomas never saw Michael again either. By the spring of 1883, Thomas was alone again. Everyone he knew had either been arrested or left or gone back to pretending. The bathhouses were still there. New ones opened. New men arrived. But Thomas could not bring himself to go back. He tried once. He walked to a place on Forsyth Street. He stood outside for 20 minutes. He could not make himself go down the steps. He went home. For a year, Thomas lived quietly. He worked. He kept to himself. He did not talk to anyone. He did not go anywhere. He told himself he was being smart. He told himself he was protecting himself. He told himself he was surviving. But he was not surviving. He was disappearing, just like Michael said. And then, in the summer of 1884, Thomas walked past a building on Mulberry Street and saw a man descending into a basement. The gesture was familiar. Thomas followed him down. The bathhouse on Mulberry Street was different. Thomas could feel it the moment he walked in. The hallway was wider. The gas lamps were brighter. The floor was tiled instead of bare wood. Someone had painted the walls a deep green. Someone had hung mirrors. It looked, Thomas thought, almost respectable. A man sat at a desk near the entrance. He was reading a newspaper. He looked up when Thomas approached. He said, "First time here?" Thomas said, "Yes." The man said, 20 cents. That includes a towel and soap." Thomas paid. 20 cents was more than he had ever paid before. The man handed him a towel that was actually clean. He pointed toward a door. He said, "Tubs are through there. Back room is past the tubs if you want privacy." Thomas walked through the door. The tub room was larger than any he had seen. 15 tubs arranged in 3 rows. Only half were occupied. The men in them looked cleaner than the men at other bathhouses, better dressed. Thomas noticed their clothes hanging on the hooks, wool suits, silk cravats, pocket watches on chains. This was not a place for dock workers. Thomas felt out of place immediately. He found an empty tub in the back corner. He undressed quickly. He climbed into the water. It was hot and clean and smelled like lavender. Someone had put lavender in the water. Thomas almost laughed. Lavender in a bathhouse. The world was changing, and he had not noticed. He closed his eyes. He let the heat soak into his skin. He tried not to think about how long it had been since he had let himself feel this. A year. A whole year of living like a ghost. A year of pretending he did not need this. A voice said, "You look like you have been holding your breath for a very long time." Thomas opened his eyes. A man was sitting in the tub next to his. Older, maybe 50. Silver hair, expensive suit hanging on the hook behind him. He had a kind face, lined with age but soft around the eyes. The man said, "I am Charles." Thomas said, "Thomas." Charles said, "Is this your first time at this establishment, Thomas? Or your first time in a very long time?" Thomas said, "The second one." Charles nodded. He said, "I thought so. You have the look of someone who swore they would never come back. And yet here you are." Thomas said, "Here I am." Charles said, "May I ask what changed?" Thomas thought about it. He said, "I got tired of disappearing." Charles smiled. He said, "That is the best reason I have heard in a long time." They sat in silence for a while. Then Charles said, "This place is new, opened 3 months ago. The owner is trying something different, cleaner, quieter, more discreet. He charges more, but he also makes sure the police stay away. Thomas said, "How does he do that?" Charles said, "Money. He pays them. Every week. A percentage of the take goes straight to the precinct captain. In exchange, they leave us alone." Thomas said, "That works." Charles said, "So far. Though I imagine it will not last. Nothing ever does." Thomas said, "You sound like you have been doing this a long time." Charles said, 30 years. I have seen places open and close. I have seen men arrested and released and arrested again. I have seen the whole cycle repeat so many times I have stopped counting." He leaned back against the tub. "But I keep coming back, because what else is there?" Thomas said, "You could stop." Charles said, "I could. But then what? Spend the rest of my life pretending? No, thank you. I tried that once. I was married for 10 years, had 2 children, played the role of devoted husband and father, and I was miserable every single day." He looked at Thomas. "When my wife died, I grieved. I genuinely grieved. She was a good woman, but I also felt relief. And that relief felt like freedom. I have been free for 20 years now. I will not give that up. Not for anyone." Thomas said, "Do you see your children?" Charles said, "No. They do not speak to me. They know what I am. Or they suspect. It amounts to the same thing." He smiled sadly. "But I am happier now than I ever was with them. I have made my peace with that." Thomas did not know what to say. He had never thought about what it would be like to be 50 and still coming to bathhouses. He had never thought about growing old in this life. He had assumed he would either get arrested and disappear, or he would eventually go back to pretending. He had never considered a third option. Just living, just continuing, just being himself for 30 years. Charles said, "How old are you, Thomas?" Thomas said, 27. Charles said, "You have time. You will figure it out. We all do eventually." A younger man approached their tubs. He was maybe 25. Dark hair, handsome in an obvious way. He smiled at Charles. He said, "I have been looking for you." Charles said, "Hello, James." James climbed into Charles's tub without asking. He sat close, very close. Charles did not move away. James looked at Thomas and said, "Friend of yours?" Charles said, "New acquaintance. Thomas, this is James." "James, Thomas." James nodded at Thomas. Then he turned his attention entirely to Charles. His hand moved under the water. Charles closed his eyes. Thomas looked away. He climbed out of his tub. He dried off. He dressed. He walked toward the back room because he did not know where else to go. The back room was quieter, darker. 6 men sat on benches arranged along the walls. No one was talking. One man was smoking. Another was reading a book by lamplight. 2 men in the corner were sitting very close together, whispering. Thomas sat on an empty bench. He did not know what he was doing here. He had come back because he could not stay away, but now that he was here, he felt lost. Everyone he had known was gone. The world had kept turning without him. New men had arrived. New places had opened. And Thomas was just a stranger starting over. A man sat down beside him. Thomas glanced over. The man was younger than him, maybe 23. Blonde hair, blue eyes, a face that looked too innocent for a place like this. The man said, "You look sad." Thomas said, "I am fine." The man said, "I am Henry." Thomas said, "Thomas." Henry said, "Is this your first time here?" Thomas said, "Yes." Henry said, "Mine too. Well, first time at this place. I have been to others, but they all got raided. I heard this one is safer." Thomas said, "That is what they say." Henry said, "Do you believe it?" Thomas said, "No." Henry laughed. He said, "Neither do I, but I come anyway." He leaned back against the wall. "I work at a hotel. I carry bags. I open doors. I smile at rich people. And every Friday night I come here because this is the only place I can stop smiling." Thomas said, I know the feeling. Henry said, Do you have someone? Thomas said, No. Henry said, Me neither. I had someone once, for about 6 months. His name was Peter. We were going to get a place together, save up money, move somewhere no one knew us, start over. He paused. Then he got arrested. They sent him to Blackwell's Island for 90 days. When he got out, he left the city, did not even say goodbye, just disappeared. Thomas said, I am sorry. Henry said, It is fine. I am used to it now. Everyone disappears eventually. He looked at Thomas. You will probably disappear too. Thomas said, Probably. They sat in silence. After a while, Henry said, Do you want to get out of here? Go somewhere else? Thomas said, Like where? Henry said, I know a place, a bar. It is not far. Men like us go there. It is safer than this. Thomas said, A bar? Henry said, You have never been to one? Thomas said, No. Henry stood up. He said, Come on, I will show you. They left the bathhouse together. They walked north on Mulberry Street and then west on Houston. The streets were crowded with people leaving theaters and restaurants, women in silk dresses, men in top hats, horse-drawn carriages rattling over cobblestones, gas lamps flickering. The city was alive and loud and completely indifferent to Thomas and Henry walking side by side. Henry led Thomas to a narrow building on Bleecker Street. The ground floor was a tobacco shop. Henry walked past it and down a flight of steps to a basement door. He knocked 3 times. The door opened. A man looked out. He recognized Henry. He stepped aside. Thomas followed Henry into the bar. It was small, maybe 20 feet across. Low ceiling, brick walls, a bar along one side, tables along the other, 15 or 20 men sitting and standing and talking. The air smelled like cigarette smoke and beer and sweat. A piano in the corner was being played badly by a man who did not care. Henry led Thomas to the bar. He ordered 2 beers. He handed one to Thomas. He said, Welcome to the slide. Thomas said, The what? Henry said, That is what they call it, the slide. I do not know why, but everyone knows the name. Thomas looked around. The men here were different from the men at the bathhouse. Louder, more relaxed. Some of them were dressed as women, makeup, dresses, wigs. They were not hiding. They were performing. Thomas had never seen anything like it. Henry saw him staring. He said, That is Stella, and that is Cicero, and the one in the red dress is Loop the Loop. Those are not their real names, obviously, but that is what everyone calls them. Thomas said, Do the police know about this place? Henry said, Of course. They raid it once a month. Everyone gets arrested. Everyone pays a fine. Then it reopens the next week. It has been like this for years. Thomas said, And people still come. Henry said, Where else are they going to go? Thomas drank his beer. He watched the men around him. Some were dancing. Some were singing along to the piano. Some were sitting close together in corners, holding hands, kissing. No one was hiding. No one was pretending. It was the most dangerous and the most liberating thing Thomas had ever seen. A man in a green dress approached them. He said, New meet. Henry said, This is Thomas. Thomas, this is Stella. Stella looked Thomas up and down. He said, Honey, you need to relax. You look like you're about to be executed. Thomas said, I feel like I am. Stella laughed. He said, First time at the slide? Thomas said, Yes. Stella said, Do not worry. We do not bite. Well, some of us do, but only if you ask nicely. He winked. Then he walked away. Henry said, Stella is harmless, loud, but harmless. Thomas said, How often do you come here? Henry said, Once or twice a week. It is cheaper than the bathhouse, and more fun. Thomas said, Do you ever worry about getting arrested? Henry said, All the time. But I come anyway. They stayed for 2 hours. Thomas drank 3 beers. He talked to Henry. He watched the men around him. He listened to the piano. He let himself feel something he had not felt in a long time. Not happiness exactly, but something close. A kind of ease. a sense that maybe, just maybe, he could survive this. At midnight, Henry said he had to go. He had to work early. Thomas walked him to the door. Henry said, "Will you come back?" Thomas said, "Maybe." Henry said, "You should. You fit in here." Thomas said, "I do not fit in anywhere." Henry said, "That is why you fit in here." Thomas walked home alone. The streets were quieter now. The theatres had closed. The restaurants had emptied. The city was settling into its late-night rhythm. Thomas felt lighter than he had in months. He felt like he had found something. Not a solution, not safety, but a place. A small corner of the world where he could exist. He went back to the slide the following Friday, and the Friday after that. By the end of the summer, Thomas had become a regular. He knew the bartender. He knew Stella and Cicero and Loop the Loop. He knew which nights were busy and which were quiet. He knew when to arrive and when to leave. He learned the rhythms of the place. He also learned the risks. In September, the police raided the slide. Thomas was there. He saw the officers come through the door. He did what everyone else did. He ran. There was a back exit through the kitchen. Thomas and 15 other men poured out into an alley. They scattered. Thomas ran 3 blocks before he stopped. His heart was pounding. His hands were shaking. But he was free. He went back the following week. The slide had reopened. Stella was there. He said, "You ran fast." Thomas said, "I have had practice." Stella said, "So have we all, honey." The raids became routine. Once a month, sometimes twice, the police would come. The men would scatter. A few would get caught. They would pay their fines. They would be released. And the next week, everyone would be back. Thomas got arrested in October. He was sitting at the bar when the police came through the door. This time, there was no warning. They blocked the exits. They grabbed everyone. Thomas did not resist. He let them put him in handcuffs. He let them march him up the stairs and into a police wagon. He sat in the wagon with 8 other men. Some of them were crying. Some were silent. Stella was laughing. He said, "Well, boys, at least the accommodations at the tombs are free." Thomas spent 2 days in jail. His case was heard by a judge who looked bored. The charge was disorderly conduct. The fine was $5. Thomas paid it. He was released. He went back to the slide the next Friday. Henry was there. He said, "I heard you got arrested." Thomas said, "I did." Henry said, "How was it?" Thomas said, "Not as bad as Blackwell's Island." Henry said, "Nothing is as bad as Blackwell's Island." Thomas met more men. He met a man named Frederick, who worked as a waiter and sent money to his mother in Pennsylvania. He met a man named Samuel, who played piano at a hotel during the day and played piano at the slide at night. He met a man named Louis who had been arrested 11 times and wore it like a badge of honor. He said, "They cannot stop me. They have tried. I keep coming back." Thomas began to understand something. This was not just a bar. This was not just a bathhouse. This was a community. A hidden, fragile, constantly threatened community. But a community nonetheless. These men took care of each other. They warned each other when the police were planning a raid. They collected money for men who could not pay their fines. They visited each other in jail. They kept each other alive. Thomas had spent a year trying to disappear, and in that year, he had almost succeeded. But now, standing in this basement bar surrounded by men who refused to disappear, he realized something. Disappearing was not survival. Disappearing was death. Survival was this: coming back, showing up, refusing to be erased. In November, Thomas met someone new. His name was William. Thomas was sitting alone at a table when William walked in. William was tall, broad-shouldered, maybe 30 years old. He had dark hair and a beard and hands that looked like they had done hard work. He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking around like he was not sure he was in the right place. Thomas recognized the look. He had worn it himself once. William's eyes met Thomas's. Thomas nodded toward the empty chair at his table. William walked over. He said, "Is this seat taken?" Thomas said, "It is now." William sat. He did not say anything for a long moment. Then he said, "I have never been here before." Thomas said, "I could tell." William said, "That obvious?" Thomas said, "You look terrified." William laughed, a short, nervous laugh. He said, "I am." Thomas said, "It gets easier." William said, "Does it?" Thomas thought about it. He said, "No, but you get used to it." William smiled. He said, "I am William." Thomas said, "Thomas." They talked for an hour. William was a carpenter. He built furniture for wealthy families uptown. He had a shop on 10th Avenue. He had never been to a bathhouse. He had never been arrested. He had spent his entire life hiding. And then, a week ago, a man had handed him a card with an address on it, the address of the slide. William had carried that card in his pocket for 7 days before he finally worked up the courage to come. Thomas said, "Why tonight?" William said, "I woke up this morning and realized I could not do it anymore. Pretend. I have been pretending my whole life. I am tired." Thomas said, "I understand." William said, "Do you?" Thomas said, "I spent a year trying to stop coming to places like this. I thought if I just tried hard enough, I could make myself normal. But I could not. So I stopped trying." William said, "What happened?" Thomas said, "I came back." They kept talking. William told Thomas about his family in New Jersey. His father wanted him to take over the family business. His mother wanted him to marry a girl from church. William wanted neither of those things. He wanted to build furniture. He wanted to live in the city. He wanted to stop lying. Thomas told William about Arthur and Michael and Edward, about the raids, about Blackwell's Island, about the year he spent disappearing. William listened to all of it without judgment. When Thomas finished, William said, "You are still here." Thomas said, "So are you." William said, "Can I see you again?" Thomas said, "Yes." They met the following Friday, and the Friday after that. By December, they were meeting twice a week, sometimes at the slide, sometimes at the bathhouse on Mulberry Street. Sometimes they just walked. They walked along the East River. They walked through Washington Square. They walked through neighborhoods where no one knew them and they could talk freely. William was different from the other men Thomas had known. He was steady, calm. He did not panic when the police came. He did not talk about leaving the city. He did not talk about disappearing. He just existed. And his existence made Thomas feel like he could exist too. In January of 1885, William asked Thomas if he wanted to see his workshop. Thomas said yes. They walked to 10th Avenue on a Sunday afternoon. The workshop was in the back of a building that smelled like sawdust and varnish. William unlocked the door. Inside, the space was filled with half-finished furniture, tables, chairs, a cabinet with intricate carvings. Everything was beautiful. Everything was made with care. William said, "I spend most of my time here. It is the only place I feel like myself." Thomas said, "It is beautiful." William said, "It is mine." They stood in the workshop, surrounded by wood and tools and the quiet hum of the city outside. William moved closer. He said, "Can I kiss you?" Thomas said, "Yes." William kissed him. Slow, careful, like he was testing to see if this was real. Thomas kissed him back. It was the first time in 2 years he had kissed anyone outside a bathhouse or a bar. It felt different. It felt honest. They pulled apart. William said, "I have wanted to do that since the first night I met you." Thomas said, "Why did you wait?" William said, "I did not know if you wanted it." Thomas said, "I did." They kissed again, this time longer, this time with less hesitation. When they finally stopped, Thomas rested his forehead against William's. He said, What are we doing? William said, I do not know, but I do not want to stop. Thomas said, neither do I. They started meeting at the workshop. It became their place, a space where they did not have to hide, where they did not have to worry about raids or arrests or being seen. They would sit on the floor surrounded by sawdust and talk for hours. Sometimes they kissed. Sometimes they just sat close. Sometimes William worked while Thomas watched. It was ordinary. It was quiet. It was the closest thing to domestic life Thomas had ever experienced. In March, William said, I have been thinking. Thomas said, about what? William said, about getting a place, a real place, not a boarding house, somewhere we could live, together. Thomas said, that is dangerous. William said, everything we do is dangerous. Thomas said, people will know. William said, people already know. They just do not say anything. Thomas thought about it. He thought about what it would mean to live with someone, to share a space, to build a life. It terrified him, but it also felt inevitable. He had been moving toward this moment since the first night he walked into a bathhouse 4 years ago. He said, all right. William said, all right? Thomas said, yes. Let us do it. They found a small apartment on Orchard Street, 2 rooms, a kitchen, a shared water closet in the hall. The rent was $12 a month. They split it. They moved in at the end of April. Thomas had never lived with anyone before. Not like this, not by choice. It was strange at first, learning each other's rhythms, learning when to talk and when to be quiet, learning how to share space without stepping on each other. But they figured it out. William built them a table. He built shelves. He built a bed frame. Thomas bought sheets and blankets and a few dishes. They made the place theirs. Their neighbors never asked questions. Or if they suspected, they kept it to themselves. Thomas and William were quiet. They paid their rent on time. They did not cause trouble. That was enough. They still went to the slide on Fridays. They still went to the bathhouse occasionally. But now they had somewhere to go afterward. Somewhere that was theirs. Somewhere they could close the door and be themselves without fear. In June, Thomas came home from work and found William sitting at the table with a newspaper. William looked upset. He said, you should read this. Thomas took the paper. There was an article about a raid. Another bathhouse had been shut down. 14 men arrested. One of them had jumped from a 3rd-story window trying to escape. He had died. The article did not give his name. It just called him a degenerate. Thomas said, did you know him? William said, I do not know. Maybe. It does not give a name. They sat in silence. After a while, Thomas said, this is never going to stop. William said, I know. Thomas said, we could leave. Go somewhere else. Somewhere safer. William said, there is nowhere safer. It is like this everywhere. Thomas said, then what do we do? William said, we keep living. What else can we do? Thomas did not have an answer. They stayed in New York. They kept their apartment. They kept going to the slide. They kept surviving. By the summer of 1885, Thomas and William had built something that resembled a life. It was small. It was precarious. But it was theirs. Thomas still worked as a clerk at the shipping company. William still built furniture. They went to work in the morning. They came home in the evening. They ate dinner together at the table William had made. They talked about ordinary things. The weather, work, a funny thing someone had said. They did not talk about the raids. They did not talk about the arrests. They did not talk about the constant low-level fear that followed them everywhere. They talked about normal things, because talking about normal things made them feel normal. On Friday nights, they went to the slide. On Saturdays, they sometimes went to the bathhouse on Mulberry Street. On Sundays, they stayed home. They read. They cleaned. William worked on furniture projects. Thomas watched. It was domestic in a way that should have been boring. It was not boring. It was the most radical thing Thomas had ever done. In July, a new man started coming to the slide. His name was George. He was older than most of the regulars, maybe 45, well-dressed, educated. He spoke with an accent that suggested money and breeding. He did not fit the usual crowd, but he came every Friday. He sat at the bar. He drank whiskey. He watched. After a few weeks, George approached Thomas and William at their table. He said, "May I join you?" William said, "Sure." George sat. He said, "I have been watching you two. You seem different from the others." Thomas said, "How so?" George said, "You seem like you have something to lose." William said, "We all have something to lose." George said, "True, but most of the men here have already lost it. You two still have hope. I can see it." He took a sip of his whiskey. "That is either very brave or very foolish." Thomas said, "Maybe both." George smiled. He said, "I like you. You are honest." He leaned back in his chair. "Let me tell you why I am here. I am writing a book, a study of men like us. I am documenting everything: the bathhouses, the bars, the raids, the arrests, the way we live, the way we survive. I want to create a record, because someday someone will want to know that we existed." William said, "Why would you do that? It is dangerous." George said, "Everything is dangerous, but if no one writes it down, we disappear, and I refuse to disappear." Thomas said, "Someone else tried that. His name was Edward. He got arrested. His notebooks were confiscated. He had to leave the city." George said, "I know. I knew Edward. We corresponded. He told me what happened to him. That is why I am being more careful. I do not keep the notebooks in the city. I send them to a friend in Boston. If I get arrested, they will not find anything." William said, "What do you want from us?" George said, "Your stories, if you are willing to share them." Thomas and William looked at each other. William shrugged. Thomas said, "All right." They talked for 2 hours. George asked questions. "Where did you grow up? When did you first know? How did you find the bathhouses? Have you been arrested? Do you live together? What does a normal day look like?" Thomas and William answered honestly. They told George things they had never told anyone, about their families, about their fears, about the small moments of joy they had managed to carve out in a world that wanted them erased. George took notes, not in a notebook. He memorized everything. He said he would write it down later, when he was alone, when it was safe. At the end of the night, George said, "Thank you. You have given me something valuable." Thomas said, "What will you do with it?" George said, "I will write it down. I will preserve it. And someday, maybe 50 years from now, maybe 100, someone will read it and know that you existed, that you lived, that you loved. That matters." Thomas did not know if that was true, but he wanted it to be. George became a regular at their table. Every Friday, he would come to the slide and sit with Thomas and William and whoever else was around. He asked questions, he listened, he remembered. He was building something, a history, an archive, a record of lives that were supposed to be invisible. In August, George brought someone new, a younger man, maybe 30, slender, dark hair, nervous energy. George introduced him as Dr. James Kiernan. He said, "James is a physician. He specializes in the study of sexual inversion." James said, "I prefer the term contrary sexual feeling. It sounds less judgmental." Thomas said, "What does that mean?" James said, "It means I study men like you. I am trying to understand why some men are attracted to other men, whether it is biological, environmental, congenital. I am trying to prove that it is not a moral failing. It is simply a variation." William said, "Good luck with that." James said, "I know it sounds impossible, but science is changing. We are starting to understand that human sexuality is more complex than anyone thought. There are men in Europe doing similar work. a doctor in Germany named Westphal, another in Austria named Krafft-Ebing. We are building a body of evidence. Someday it might make a difference. Thomas said, "Do you really believe that?" James said, "I have to." They talked for hours. James asked clinical questions. How old were you when you first felt attraction to another man? Have you ever been attracted to women? Do you have siblings who share this tendency? Have you experienced trauma? Thomas answered as best he could. He did not know if his answers were helpful, but James seemed to think they were. At the end of the night, James said, "I want you to know that I do not think there is anything wrong with you. Society thinks there is. The law thinks there is. But I do not. You are simply different, and different is not wrong." Thomas said, "Tell that to the police." James said, "I am trying. I have written papers. I have given lectures. Most people do not want to listen, but some do. It is a start." After James left, William said, "Do you think any of that matters? Doctors writing papers, men writing books. Does any of it actually change anything?" Thomas said, "I do not know, but it feels like something." William said, "What?" Thomas said, "Proof that we were here, that we existed. Even if nothing changes, at least someone will know." In September, the slide was raided again. Thomas and William were not there. They had stayed home that night. The next day, they heard that 20 men had been arrested. Stella was one of them. Loop the Loop was another. The bar was shut down for 2 weeks. When it reopened, fewer men came. Some had been scared off. Some had been arrested and not released. Some had simply disappeared. The place felt emptier, quieter, like something had been lost. Stella came back eventually. He looked thinner, older. He said he had spent 10 days in jail. He said it was worse this time. The guards had been cruel. Other prisoners had been violent. He had been beaten. He showed them the bruises. Thomas said, "I am sorry." Stella said, "It is not your fault, honey. It is just the way things are." William said, "You do not have to come back here. You could go somewhere safer." Stella laughed, a bitter laugh. He said, "There is nowhere safer. This is all we have." By the winter of 1885, Thomas had been part of this world for 5 years. He had been arrested twice. He had watched friends disappear. He had seen places open and close. He had learned to live with constant fear, and he had learned that fear was not the same as defeat. He still went to the bathhouses. He still went to the slide. He still showed up, because showing up was the only act of resistance he had. In December, William came home with news. He said, "I heard about a new place, a bathhouse. It is supposed to be the nicest one in the city." Thomas said, "Where?" William said, "Uptown, near Gramercy Park. It costs 50 cents, but they say it is worth it." Thomas said, 50 cents? That is more than I make in half a day." William said, "I know, but I want to see it, just once. Will you come with me?" They went on a Saturday afternoon. The bathhouse was in the basement of a townhouse on Irving Place. The entrance was through a side door. Discreet, elegant. Inside, the hallway was carpeted. The walls were papered in dark green silk. Gas lamps in glass fixtures cast warm light. It looked more like a gentleman's club than a bathhouse. A man in a suit sat at a desk. He looked at Thomas and William and said, "Are you members?" William said, "No, we are here for a bath." The man said, 50 cents each. That includes a private tub, soap, towels, and access to the lounge." William paid $1. Thomas felt guilty. That was a significant amount of money, but William did not seem to care. They were led down a hallway to a room with 2 copper tubs separated by a folding screen. The tubs were larger than any Thomas had seen. The water was already hot. Steam rose. The room smelled like eucalyptus. There were fresh towels on a shelf, a bar of expensive soap, a bottle of oil. Thomas said, "This is incredible." William said, "I told you." They undressed. They climbed into separate tubs. The water was hotter than usual, almost too hot. But after a moment, Thomas's body adjusted. He sank down until the water reached his chin. He closed his eyes. He could hear William in the next tub, the sound of water sloshing, a contented sigh. Thomas smiled. After a while, William said, "This is what it should be like. All the time. Not hiding in basements, not worrying about raids. Just this." Thomas said, "That will never happen." William said, "I know, but I can imagine it." They stayed for an hour. When they finally got out, they dried off and dressed and walked to the lounge. It was a large room with velvet chairs and low tables. 6 or 7 men were sitting around reading newspapers or talking quietly. Everyone was well dressed. Everyone looked comfortable. No one looked afraid. Thomas and William sat in 2 chairs near a window. A man brought them tea, actual tea in porcelain cups. Thomas almost laughed. He had gone from dodging police in filthy basements to drinking tea in a gentleman's lounge. The absurdity was overwhelming. A man approached them. He was older, maybe 60, white hair, expensive suit. He said, "I have not seen you here before." William said, "It is our first time." The man said, "Welcome, I am Lawrence." Thomas said, "Thomas, this is William." Lawrence sat in a chair across from them. He said, "This is the finest establishment of its kind in the city, perhaps in the entire country. The owner pays a great deal of money to ensure privacy and discretion. You will not find a safer place." William said, "How long has it been open?" Lawrence said, 2 years, no raids, no arrests. The police know about it, of course, but they leave it alone. The clientele is too wealthy, too connected. Arresting us would cause problems." Thomas said, "So you just pay enough money and the law does not apply?" Lawrence said, "Precisely." Thomas felt anger rising in his chest. He said, "What about the men who cannot pay? The men in the basement bathhouses who get arrested every month?" Lawrence said, "What about them?" Thomas said, "They deserve the same safety." Lawrence smiled, a condescending smile. He said, "The world is not fair, young man. Surely you have learned that by now. We protect our own. If you can afford to be here, you are protected. If you cannot, well, that is unfortunate." Thomas stood up. He said, "We should go." William said, "Thomas." Thomas said, "Now." They left. They walked back to their apartment in silence. Thomas was furious, not at Lawrence specifically, at everything, at the unfairness of it all, at the fact that safety was a commodity that only the rich could afford, at the fact that men like Stella and Loop the Loop and Michael would never be protected because they did not have money. When they got home, William said, "You are angry." Thomas said, "Of course I am angry." William said, "It is not fair, I know, but it is the way things are." Thomas said, "That does not make it right." William said, "No, but getting angry does not change it." Thomas said, "Then what does?" William did not have an answer. They sat at their table. They did not talk. After a while, William reached across and took Thomas's hand. He said, "We are doing the best we can. That is all anyone can do." Thomas said, "Is it enough?" William said, "It has to be." In January of 1886, George stopped coming to the slide. No one knew why. Someone said he had been arrested. Someone else said he had left the city. Thomas never found out. George simply disappeared, like so many others. Dr. Kiernan kept coming. He still asked questions. He still took notes in his head. He told Thomas and William that his research was progressing. He had interviewed over 50 men. He was writing a paper. He hoped to publish it in a medical journal. He said it would be the first comprehensive study of sexual inversion in America. Thomas said, "Will it change anything?" Kiernan said, "Probably not, but it will exist, and that matters." In February, the bathhouse on Mulberry Street was raided. Thomas and William were there. They were in the back room when the police came. They ran. This time, they made it out. But 12 men did not. 12 men were arrested and taken to the tombs. Thomas and William went to the courthouse the next day. They wanted to see who had been caught. They stood in the back of the courtroom and watched as the men were brought before the judge one by one. Most of them pleaded guilty. The fines ranged from $5 to $20. One man could not pay. He was sentenced to 30 days. That man was Henry. Thomas had not seen Henry in months. He looked different, thinner. His clothes were shabby. When the judge sentenced him, Henry did not react. He just nodded, like he had expected it. Thomas tried to visit him at the tombs. They would not let him in. He was not family. He was not a lawyer. He was no one. So he went home. William said, "There is nothing you can do." Thomas said, "I know." William said, "Henry will survive. He has before." Thomas said, "What if he does not want to survive anymore?" William did not have an answer. Henry was released in March. Thomas saw him at the slide a few weeks later. Henry looked hollowed out, like something essential had been taken from him. They sat together. They did not talk much. Henry drank. Thomas watched. After a while, Henry said, "I am leaving." Thomas said, "Where will you go?" Henry said, "I do not know. West, maybe. I heard there are cities out there where it is easier. San Francisco, Portland. I do not know if that is true, but I have to believe it is." Thomas said, "When?" Henry said, "Soon. I am saving money. Another few months." Thomas said, "Good luck." Henry said, "You should leave too. You and William. Get out of this city. It is only going to get worse." Thomas said, "We have a life here." Henry said, "You have a life that can be taken away at any moment. That is not a life. That is just waiting to be destroyed." Thomas did not argue. He knew Henry was right. But Thomas did not leave. Neither did William. They stayed. They kept their apartment. They kept their jobs. They kept going to the slide and the bathhouses. They kept surviving. In April, a new bathhouse opened on Avenue A. It was run by a man named Otto, German immigrant, big, loud, friendly. Otto did not care about discretion. He cared about volume. He charged 10 cents. He packed the place. On a Friday night, there might be 40 men in a space meant for 20. It was chaos. It was loud. It was the opposite of the uptown bathhouse. Thomas loved it. He and William went every other week. They sat in overcrowded tubs. They listened to men argue in 6 different languages. They watched Otto kick out men who caused trouble and welcome back men who had been arrested. Otto did not care who you were. As long as you paid your 10 cents and did not start a fight, you were welcome. One night, Thomas was sitting in a tub when a young man climbed in across from him. The young man was maybe 18, baby-faced, scared. He looked like he was about to cry. Thomas said, "First time?" The young man nodded. Thomas said, "It gets easier." The young man said, "Does it?" Thomas thought about it. He thought about the last 6 years, the arrests, the fear, the friends who had disappeared, the constant threat of violence. He thought about all of it. He said, "No, but you get used to it." The young man said, "I do not think I can." Thomas said, "You can. You are here. That is the hardest part. Everything after this is just repetition." The young man said, "I am supposed to get married next month to a girl my parents picked. I do not want to, but I do not know what else to do." Thomas said, "Do you love her?" The young man said, "No." Thomas said, "Then do not marry her." The young man said, "What else can I do?" Thomas said, "Live, alone if you have to, but live honestly. Do not spend your whole life pretending." The young man said, "Is that what you do?" Thomas said, "I am trying." The young man said, "Is it worth it?" Thomas looked across the bathhouse. He saw William sitting in another tub talking to Otto. He saw men laughing, men touching, men being themselves. He saw a world that was dangerous and fragile and constantly under threat. but he also saw a world that existed, that persisted, that refused to disappear. He said, "Yes, it is worth it." The young man nodded. He did not look convinced, but he stayed. He sat in that tub for an hour, and then he came back the following week, and the week after that, and eventually he stopped looking scared. Thomas watched him transform, from terrified boy to cautious participant to regular. It was the same transformation Thomas had gone through 6 years ago, the same transformation every man in this room had gone through, the process of becoming yourself. In May, Thomas turned 29. William was 31. They had been together for over a year. They had been living together for 13 months. It was the longest relationship either of them had ever had. They did not celebrate. They did not make a big deal of it. They just kept living. One Sunday afternoon, they were sitting at their table. William was sketching a design for a new chair. Thomas was reading a newspaper. It was ordinary. It was domestic. It was the kind of scene that would be unremarkable in any other household. But for them, it was revolutionary. William looked up from his sketch. He said, "Do you ever think about the future?" Thomas said, "Sometimes." William said, "What do you see?" Thomas said, "Honestly, I do not see much. I see us, here, doing this, for as long as we can." William said, "That is enough?" Thomas said, "It has to be." William nodded. He went back to his sketch. Thomas went back to his newspaper. And the afternoon continued. Quiet, unremarkable, perfect. By the summer of 1886, Thomas had been part of this world for 6 years. He had seen places open and close. He had seen men arrested and released and arrested again. He had seen friends disappear and new friends arrive. The cycle was endless. The city kept trying to erase them, and they kept refusing to be erased. Otto's bathhouse was raided in June. Thomas and William were not there. Otto was arrested. He spent a week in jail. When he was released, he reopened the bathhouse the next day. He said the police could raid him every week if they wanted. He would keep opening. They could not stop him. The slide was raided in July. Stella was arrested again. This time, he was sentenced to 60 days. When he was released, he looked 20 years older. He said he was done. He was leaving New York. He was going to Philadelphia. He had a cousin there. He would start over. Thomas said, "Will you come back?" Stella said, "No, honey. I am too old for this. I have been arrested 9 times. I have spent a total of 8 months in jail. I cannot do it anymore." Thomas said, "I will miss you." Stella smiled. A sad smile. He said, "You are sweet. Take care of yourself. And take care of that man of yours. Men like William are rare. Do not let him go." Thomas said, "I will not." Stella left the next week. Thomas never saw him again. Loop the Loop disappeared too. No one knew where he went. One week he was there, the next week he was gone. That was how it worked. People appeared. People disappeared. The community was constantly shifting, constantly reforming around whoever was left. By the end of 1886, Thomas and William had been together for nearly 2 years. They had survived longer than most couples in their world. Most relationships Thomas had witnessed lasted a few weeks, maybe a few months. The pressure was too great, the fear too constant. Men disappeared, men got arrested, men gave up and went back to pretending. Men married women and vanished into respectable lives. But Thomas and William had lasted. They had built something that endured. Their apartment on Orchard Street had become a kind of refuge, not just for them. Other men started coming by, quietly, one at a time. Men who needed a place to talk, men who needed advice, men who had just been released from jail and had nowhere else to go. Thomas and William never turned anyone away. On a Tuesday night in January of 1887, there was a knock on their door. Thomas opened it. A young man stood in the hallway, maybe 20 years old. His face was bruised, his lip was split, he was shaking. The young man said, "Otto sent me. He said you would help." Thomas said, "Come in." The young man's name was Paul. He worked in a factory. He had been meeting a man in an alley behind a tavern on Delancey Street. Someone had seen them. A group of men had followed Paul home. They had beaten him. They had called him names. They had told him if they saw him again, they would kill him. William got a wet cloth. He cleaned the blood from Paul's face. Thomas made tea. They sat at the table. Paul cried. He said he could not go back to his boarding house. The landlord had seen the bruises. He had asked questions. Paul had not answered. The landlord had told him to leave by morning. Thomas said, "You can stay here tonight." Paul said, "I do not have anywhere else to go after that." William said, "We will figure it out." Paul slept on the floor. Thomas gave him a blanket and a pillow. In the morning, William went to see Otto. Otto knew a man who owned a boarding house on Essex Street. The man did not ask questions. He had a room available. Paul moved in that afternoon. A week later, Paul came back. He said thank you. He said he had found work at a different factory. He was surviving. He asked if he could come by sometimes, just to talk. Thomas said yes. Paul became a regular visitor. So did others. By the spring of 1887, there were 5 or 6 men who would stop by the apartment on various nights. They would sit. They would talk. They would share stories. It was not organized. It was not formal. It was just a group of men who needed to know they were not alone. One night, a man named David said, "We should have a name." William said, "For what?" David said, "For this, for what we are doing." Thomas said, "We are not doing anything. We are just sitting here." David said, "Exactly. We are sitting here. Together. Not hiding. That is something." They did not pick a name, but the gatherings continued. Every Tuesday and Thursday. Sometimes 3 men would show up, sometimes 8. They would sit in Thomas and William's small apartment and talk about their lives, about work, about family, about the constant effort of pretending, about the small moments of freedom they found in bathhouses and bars, about survival. Dr. Kiernan came a few times. He listened. He asked questions. He told them that what they were doing was important. He said they were creating community. He said that community was the only thing that would save them. Thomas said, "Save us from what?" Kiernan said, "From isolation, from despair, from disappearing one by one." In March, the police raided Otto's bathhouse again. This time, they arrested 23 men. Otto was charged with running a disorderly house. He was sentenced to 6 months. The bathhouse was shut down permanently. The building owner refused to rent to him again. Otto disappeared. Some said he went back to Germany. Some said he opened another bathhouse in Brooklyn. Thomas never found out. Otto was just gone, like so many others. The men who had been arrested were released over the following weeks. Most of them paid fines. A few served short sentences. One man, a clerk named Benjamin, was sentenced to 90 days because he had been arrested before. When he was released, he came to Thomas and William's apartment. He looked destroyed. Benjamin said, "I lost my job. My landlord evicted me. My family will not speak to me. I have nothing." William said, "You have us." Benjamin started crying. He said, "What good does that do?" Thomas did not have an answer, because Benjamin was right. Having a community of other outcasts did not pay rent. It did not get you a job. It did not protect you from the law. It was something, but it was not enough. Benjamin stayed with them for a week. Then he left the city. He said he was going to Boston. He had heard there were factories there that would hire anyone. He did not know if it was true, but he had to try. Thomas said, "Will you come back?" Benjamin said, "No, I am done with New York." Another one gone. By the summer of 1887, the landscape had shifted again. The slide was still operating, but it had moved to a new location on Bleecker Street. The old place had been raided so many times the owner had given up. The new place was smaller, quieter. Fewer men came. The atmosphere was different, more cautious, less joyful. The bathhouse on Mulberry Street had closed. The one on Christie Street had closed. The uptown bathhouse on Irving Place was still operating, But Thomas and William never went back. They could not afford it. And they could not stomach the inequality. There were new places. There were always new places. A bathhouse opened on Rivington Street, another on Attorney Street. They would last a few months, maybe a year. Then they would be raided and shut down, and new ones would open somewhere else. The cycle was endless. Thomas turned 30 in May of 1887. He had been living in New York for 11 years. He had been part of this hidden world for 7. He had been arrested twice. He had watched friends disappear. He had seen the community fracture and reform and fracture again. He had learned that survival was not a straight line. It was a constant process of rebuilding. One night, William said, "Do you ever regret it?" Thomas said, "Regret what?" William said, "This, all of it. The fear, the hiding, the constant threat. Do you ever wish you were different?" Thomas thought about it. He said, "Sometimes, when I am scared, when I think about how much easier life would be if I just married some woman and pretended. But then I think about you, about this, about the fact that I get to live honestly, even if it is dangerous, and I do not regret it." William said, "I do not regret it either." They sat in silence. Then William said, "I have been thinking about leaving the city." Thomas said, "Where would we go?" William said, "I do not know. Somewhere quieter. Somewhere the police do not raid bathhouses every month. Somewhere we could just live." Thomas said, "There is nowhere like that." William said, "Maybe not, but it is nice to imagine." They did not leave. They stayed, because leaving felt like giving up. And they were not ready to give up. In August, a new man started coming to the Tuesday gatherings. His name was Isaac. He was older than most of the group, maybe 40. He was a tailor. He had been married for 15 years. His wife had died 2 years ago. He said he had loved her. He also said he had been lying to her for their entire marriage. Isaac said, "I would meet men in parks, in alleys, anywhere I could. I would tell her I was working late. She believed me. She never suspected. And I felt guilty every single day." Someone said, "Do you still feel guilty?" Isaac said, "Yes, but I also feel free. For the first time in my life, I do not have to lie to anyone." Paul said, "Do you go to the bathhouses?" Isaac said, "Sometimes, but I prefer this. Sitting here, talking. I spent 15 years hiding. I do not want to hide anymore, even if it means I get arrested." David said, "You will get arrested, eventually. We all will." Isaac said, "I know, but I would rather be arrested for being honest than spend the rest of my life pretending." The men in the room nodded. They understood. In September, Dr. Kiernan stopped coming to the gatherings. He sent a letter. He said his paper had been rejected by 3 medical journals. He said the editors told him the subject matter was too controversial, too obscene. He said he was going to keep trying, but he needed to focus on his other work. He said he was sorry. Thomas read the letter to the group. Paul said, "So that is it? No one will publish the truth?" Thomas said, "I guess not." David said, "Then what was the point? All those interviews, all those questions. If no one will ever read it, what was the point?" Thomas said, "The point is that he tried. The point is that someone cared enough to ask." Isaac said, "That is not enough." Thomas said, "Maybe not, but it is something." The gatherings continued, but the mood had shifted. The men were more pessimistic, more resigned. The constant arrests were wearing them down. The constant fear was exhausting. Some men stopped coming. They disappeared back into their private lives. They stopped taking risks. They stopped showing up. By the winter of 1887, the Tuesday gatherings had shrunk to 4 regulars: Thomas, William, Paul, and Isaac. Sometimes David, sometimes a new face, but mostly just the 4 of them, sitting in a small apartment on Orchard Street, talking, surviving. In December, Paul was arrested. He had been meeting a man in an alley. The police had been watching. They grabbed both of them. Paul was charged with solicitation. The other man was charged with sodomy. Paul was sentenced to 30 days. The other man got 6 months. When Paul was released in January of 1888, he came to the apartment. He looked different, harder, older. He said, "I am leaving." Thomas said, "Where?" Paul said, "West. California, maybe. I heard there is gold. I heard there are cities where no one cares what you do. I do not know if it is true, but I have to find out." Thomas said, "When?" Paul said, "Next week. I saved enough for a train ticket. I am going." William said, "Good luck." Paul said, "Thank you. For everything. For letting me stay here. For giving me a place to come. You saved my life. I mean that." Thomas said, "You saved yourself. We just gave you a place to sit." Paul left the following week. He wrote one letter from St. Louis. Then nothing. Thomas never heard from him again. Isaac stopped coming in February. Thomas went to his apartment to check on him. The landlord said Isaac had moved. No forwarding address, just gone. David stopped coming in March. No explanation. He just stopped showing up. By the spring of 1888, it was just Thomas and William. The gatherings had ended. The community had dissolved. Again. It happened like this. People would come together for a while. They would build something. And then the pressure would become too much and everyone would scatter. And then, months or years later, a new group would form. Different people, same struggle. Thomas and William went back to their quiet life. Work, home. Occasionally the slide, occasionally a bathhouse. But mostly they stayed home. It felt safer, it felt smaller, but it was all they had. In June, William came home with news. He said, "I heard they are opening a new bathhouse on Hester Street. The owner is someone Otto used to know, someone who knows how to keep the police away." Thomas said, "How?" William said, "Money, lots of it. He pays everyone, the precinct captain, the beat cops, the city inspectors. Everyone gets a cut. In exchange, they leave the place alone." Thomas said, "That sounds familiar." William said, "I know, but this one is different. It is not uptown prices. 15 cents. Same as before." Thomas said, "Do you want to go?" William said, "I do." They went on a Saturday afternoon. The bathhouse on Hester Street was in the basement of a tenement building. The entrance was unmarked. Inside, it looked like every other bathhouse Thomas had been to. Narrow hallway, dim light, the smell of soap and steam. 8 tubs, a back room. Nothing special. But the atmosphere was different. The men inside looked relaxed. They were talking, laughing. No one looked over their shoulder every 5 seconds. No one looked like they were expecting the police to burst in at any moment. Thomas and William climbed into a tub together. The water was hot, clean. They sat across from each other. William smiled. He said, "This is nice." Thomas said, "It is." They stayed for 2 hours. They talked to a few men. One was a baker. One was a printer. One was a clerk at a law office. Normal men. Working men. Men who just wanted a place to exist. As they were getting dressed, the owner came over. His name was Samuel. He was short, stocky, friendly. He said, "You are new here." William said, "Yes. Otto told us about you." Samuel's face lit up. He said, "Otto, that man is a legend. How is he?" William said, "We do not know. He disappeared after his arrest." Samuel's smile faded. He said, "Damn, I was hoping he made it out." He shook his head. "Well, you are welcome here any time. I run a clean place. No trouble, no raids. I make sure of it." Thomas said, "How long do you think that will last?" Samuel said, "As long as I keep paying. The moment I stop, they will shut me down. But I do not plan to stop." Thomas and William went back every other week. It became their regular spot. The place never got raided. Samuel was true to his word. He paid. The police stayed away. It was the most stable bathhouse Thomas had ever known. In August, Thomas and William were at Samuel's bathhouse when a young man walked in who looked familiar. It took Thomas a moment to place him. Then he remembered. The 18-year-old boy from Otto's bathhouse 2 years ago. The one who had been about to get married. The one Thomas had told to live honestly. The young man recognized Thomas too. He smiled. He walked over. He said, "I remember you." Thomas said, "I remember you too. Did you get married?" The young man said, "No, I called it off 2 days before the wedding. It was the hardest thing I have ever done. My parents disowned me. They have not spoken to me in 2 years." Thomas said, "I am sorry." The young man said, "Do not be. You were right. It is worth it. Living honestly, even when it is hard, it is worth it." Thomas said, "What is your name?" The young man said, "Jacob." Thomas said, "I am Thomas. This is William." Jacob said, "Can I sit with you?" They sat together in the back room. Jacob told them about the last 2 years. He had moved out of his parents' house. He had found work as a bookkeeper. He lived alone in a small room on Broome Street. He went to bathhouses. He went to the slide. He met men. He had not been arrested yet. But he knew it would happen eventually. Everyone got arrested eventually. Jacob said, "But I am not afraid anymore. Or at least I am less afraid. I know what I am. I know what I want. And I am not going to spend my life hiding." William said, "Good for you." Jacob said, "I owe you, both of you. You were the first people who told me it was possible to live this way. I did not believe you at first, but you were right." Thomas said, "We are just surviving, same as you." Jacob said, "Maybe, but you are surviving together. That is more than most people get." Thomas looked at William. William looked back. They had been together for 3 years. 3 years. In their world, that was a lifetime. They had survived raids, arrests, friends disappearing, the constant fear. And they were still here. Still together. Jacob started coming to Samuel's bathhouse every week. He and Thomas and William would sit in the back room and talk. Sometimes other men would join. Sometimes it was just the 3 of them. It was not the same as the Tuesday gatherings had been. It was smaller, more informal, but it was something. In October, Samuel pulled Thomas aside. He said, "I need to tell you something." Thomas said, "What?" Samuel said, "I am closing the bathhouse." Thomas said, "Why? You said it was safe." Samuel said, "It is, for now. But the precinct captain got transferred. The new captain wants more money. Twice as much. I cannot afford it. I tried to negotiate. He said if I do not pay, he will raid the place and arrest everyone. So I am closing." Thomas said, "When?" Samuel said, "End of the month." Thomas told William. William said, "Of course, nothing lasts." They went to Samuel's bathhouse every day for the last 2 weeks of October. So did Jacob. So did a lot of other men. Everyone knew it was ending. Everyone wanted to soak up as much time as they could. On the last night, Samuel threw a party. He served beer and whiskey. Someone brought a violin. Men danced, men sang, men cried. It was a funeral and a celebration at the same time. At midnight, Samuel stood on a chair. He said, "Thank you, all of you, for making this place what it was. They can shut down the building, but they cannot shut down what we built here. You all know where to find each other. Keep finding each other. That is all we can do." Everyone cheered. The next day, the bathhouse was empty. Samuel locked the door, and another place disappeared. Thomas and William went back to their quiet life. Jacob still came by their apartment once a week. They would sit. They would talk. It was enough. In December of 1888, Thomas came home from work and found William sitting at the table with a letter. William's face was pale. Thomas said, "What is wrong?" William said, "My father died." Thomas sat down. He said, I am sorry. William said, I am not. He was a terrible man, but my mother wants me to come home, for the funeral, to help settle the estate. Thomas said, Will you go? William said, I do not know. I have not spoken to them in 5 years. They do not know about you. They do not know about my life. If I go back, I will have to pretend. I will have to be the son they think I am. Thomas said, You do not have to go. William said, She is my mother. William went to New Jersey for the funeral. He was gone for a week. When he came back, he looked exhausted. He said, It was awful. Everyone asking why I'm not married. Everyone asking when I'm going to settle down. My mother crying. My sisters judging. I sat through it all and smiled and lied. And the whole time, all I could think about was you. And this apartment. And our life. And how much I wanted to be back here. Thomas said, You are back now. William said, I am never going back there. Ever. They are not my family. You are my family. Thomas did not know what to say, so he just held William. And they sat together in the small apartment they had built, the small life they had carved out. It was fragile. It was dangerous. But it was theirs. By the end of 1888, Thomas had been part of this world for 8 years. He was 31 years old. He had survived longer than he ever thought he would. He had watched the world try to erase him, and he had refused to be erased. The bathhouses kept opening and closing. The bars kept getting raided. The men kept getting arrested. But the community persisted. It fractured. It reformed. It adapted. It survived. Because that was all they could do. Survive. In January of 1889, a new bathhouse opened on Ludlow Street. Thomas and William went. So did Jacob. So did a dozen other men they recognized from previous places. Different location. Same faces. Same struggle. The owner's name was Abraham. He was young, maybe 25. Enthusiastic. He said he had a plan to keep the place open permanently. He said he had connections. He said he knew how to handle the police. Thomas had heard this before. He did not believe it, but he showed up anyway. Because showing up was all he had. Abraham's bathhouse lasted 3 months. In April of 1889, the police raided it. 19 men were arrested. Abraham was charged with running a house of prostitution. The charge was absurd. It was also effective. Abraham was sentenced to a year. The bathhouse was shut down permanently. Thomas was not there that night. Neither was William. But Jacob was. Jacob spent 10 days in the tombs before his case was heard. When he was released, he came to the apartment. He looked hollow. He said the guards had beaten him. He said the other prisoners had called him names. He said he had never been so afraid in his life. Thomas said, I am sorry. Jacob said, I cannot do this anymore. I cannot keep living like this, waiting to be arrested, waiting to be beaten, waiting to be destroyed. William said, What will you do? Jacob said, I do not know. Jacob stopped coming to the apartment after that. Thomas saw him once at a different bathhouse months later. Jacob looked different, quieter, more guarded. They nodded to each other but did not speak. Whatever connection they had built had been severed by fear. By the summer of 1889, Thomas and William had been together for 4 years. 4 years was extraordinary. 4 years was almost unheard of. Most men in their world could not sustain relationships for more than a few months. The pressure was too great, the fear too constant. But Thomas and William had lasted. They did not talk about the future anymore. The future felt too uncertain, too fragile. They talked about the present, about small things, about what they would have for dinner, about a chair William was building, about a letter Thomas had received from a cousin upstate. They filled their lives with ordinary details because ordinary details made them feel human. One evening in July, they were walking home from a bathhouse on Forsyth Street when they saw 2 police officers on the corner ahead. Thomas and William had not done anything wrong. They were just walking. But the sight of police still made Thomas's chest tighten. still made his hands shake. William whispered, "Just keep walking." They walked past the officers. The officers looked at them. One of them said something to the other. They both laughed. Thomas kept walking. William kept walking. They did not look back. When they got home, William said, "Do you think they knew?" Thomas said, "Maybe, probably. Does it matter?" William said, "I suppose not." Thomas said, "We have been lucky. 4 years, and we have only been arrested in raids. Never on the street, never at home. That is more luck than most men get." William said, "I do not want luck. I want safety." Thomas said, "There is no safety. Not for us. There never will be." William was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Do you think it will ever change? In our lifetime? Do you think there will ever be a time when we can just exist without fear?" Thomas said, "No." William said, "Then what is the point?" Thomas said, "The point is that we exist anyway. The point is that we refuse to disappear. That is all the point we need." In September, the slide was raided for what must have been the 20th time. The bar reopened 2 weeks later in yet another new location. Thomas and William went. The place was nearly empty, 5 or 6 men, the bartender, a man playing piano in the corner. The energy was gone. The joy was gone. It felt like everyone was just going through the motions. Thomas and William stayed for one drink. Then they left. They never went back. They stopped going to bathhouses too. Not entirely, but less frequently. Once a month. Then once every few months. It was not a conscious decision. It just happened. They had each other. They had their apartment. They did not need the bathhouses the way they once had. The bathhouses had been about finding connection, about finding community. But the community kept dissolving, and Thomas was tired of rebuilding. In December of 1889, William's workshop was broken into. Someone smashed the windows. Someone destroyed half the furniture he had been working on. Someone painted a word on the wall. A slur. The same slur that had followed men like them for centuries. William stood in the middle of the wreckage and cried. Thomas held him. He did not say anything. There was nothing to say. They cleaned up the workshop. William replaced the windows. He started rebuilding the furniture. But something had changed. William was quieter after that. More withdrawn. He still went to work. He still came home. But he seemed farther away. Thomas tried to reach him. He asked if William wanted to talk. William said no. Thomas asked if there was anything he could do. William said no. So Thomas just stayed close. He made dinner. He sat beside William in the evenings. He was present. It was all he could offer. In February of 1890, William said, "I've been thinking about what you said. About existing anyway. About refusing to disappear." Thomas said, "Yes?" William said, "I do not know if I can do it anymore. I am tired. I am so tired." Thomas said, "I know." William said, "Do you ever think about just giving up? Just going back to pretending?" Thomas said, "All the time." William said, "Why do not you?" Thomas looked at him. He said, "Because of you. Because if I give up, I lose you. And losing you would be worse than anything the police could do to me." William started crying. He said, "I do not deserve you." Thomas said, "Yes, you do." They sat together in silence. After a while, William said, "I am not giving up. I just needed to say it out loud, to admit how hard it is." Thomas said, "It is the hardest thing in the world." William said, "But we are still here." Thomas said, "We are still here." By the spring of 1890, Thomas and William had been together for 5 years. 5 years. Thomas had not imagined this was possible. When he first walked into the Lafayette in 1880, he had been terrified. He had been alone. He had been convinced he would spend his entire life hiding. But here he was, 10 years later, living with someone he loved, still showing up, still existing. The world had not changed. The laws had not changed. The police still raided bathhouses. The courts still convicted men for loving each other. The newspapers still called them degenerates. Society still wanted them erased. But they were not erased. They were here. In May, Thomas went to a bathhouse on Attorney Street. It was a new place, small, only 4 tubs. William had stayed home that day. He was not feeling well. Thomas went alone. He climbed into a tub and closed his eyes and let the hot water soak into his skin. He thought about the first time he had done this. 10 years ago. A different bathhouse. A different version of himself. He had been so scared then. He was still scared now, but the fear was different. It was familiar. It was manageable. A voice said, "You look peaceful." Thomas opened his eyes. A young man was sitting in the tub beside his, maybe 22, dark hair, soft features. He looked nervous. He looked exactly the way Thomas had looked 10 years ago. Thomas said, "First time?" The young man nodded. Thomas said, "It gets easier." The young man said, "Does it?" Thomas thought about it. He thought about everything he had been through, the arrests, the fear, the friends who had disappeared, the constant threat of violence. He thought about all of it. He said, "No, but you learn to carry it." The young man said, "I do not know if I can." Thomas said, "You can. You are here. That is the hardest part." The young man said, "What if I get arrested?" Thomas said, "You probably will, eventually. Most of us do." The young man said, "Then what is the point?" Thomas said, "The point is that you get to be yourself. Even if it is only for a few hours a week. Even if it is only in a basement somewhere. You get to stop pretending. That is worth everything." The young man said, "Is it?" Thomas said, "Yes." They sat in silence for a while. Then the young man said, "Do you have someone?" Thomas said, "Yes. We have been together for 5 years." The young man's eyes widened. He said, 5 years? How is that possible?" Thomas said, "I do not know. Luck, stubbornness, love. Probably all 3. The young man said, "I want that." Thomas said, "Then keep coming back. Keep showing up. Keep refusing to disappear. That is all you can do." The young man said, "Will I see you here again?" Thomas said, "Maybe, probably. This is a small world. We all end up in the same places eventually." When Thomas got home that evening, William was sitting at the table sketching. He looked up. He said, "How was it?" Thomas said, "I met a kid, 22. Terrified. It was like looking at myself 10 years ago." William said, "What did you tell him?" Thomas said, "The truth. That it is hard. That he will probably get arrested. That it is worth it anyway." William said, "Do you believe that?" Thomas said, "Yes. Do you?" William thought about it. He said, "Yes, I do." Thomas sat down beside him. He looked at William's sketch. It was a design for a bookshelf. Intricate. Beautiful. Thomas said, "This is lovely." William said, "It is for us. I thought we could use more shelves." Thomas said, "We do not have any books." William said, "Then we will get some." Thomas smiled. He said, "All right." In June of 1890, Thomas turned 33. William turned 34. They did not celebrate. They just lived. They went to work. They came home. They ate dinner. They sat together in the evenings. They existed. One night, Thomas said, "Do you remember the first night we met?" William said, "At the slide. You were sitting alone. You looked miserable." Thomas said, "I was miserable." William said, "I almost did not talk to you. I thought you would tell me to go away." Thomas said, "I am glad you did not think that." William said, "Me too." Thomas said, "Do you ever regret it? Choosing this life, choosing me?" William said, "Never. Not once. Not even on the worst days. "This is the only life I want." Thomas said, "Even though it is dangerous?" William said, "Especially because it is dangerous, because it is ours, because we built it ourselves." In August, the bathhouse on Attorney Street was raided. Thomas was not there, but he heard about it. 15 men arrested. The owner charged with running a disorderly house. Another place gone. Thomas did not go to another bathhouse after that. He did not need to. He had what he needed. In September of 1890, Thomas and William celebrated 5 years of living together. They did not make a big deal of it. They just acknowledged it. 5 years. In a world that wanted them destroyed, they had built 5 years of life together. That was a miracle. William said, "Do you think we will get another 5? Thomas said, "I do not know. I hope so." William said, "Me too." By the winter of 1890, the landscape had shifted again. New bathhouses had opened. New bars. New places where men could meet. The community was still there. Smaller, more fragmented, but still there. Men were still showing up, still refusing to disappear. Thomas heard about some of them. A man named Simon had opened a bathhouse in Brooklyn. A man named Marcus was running a bar on the Lower East Side. Men Thomas had never met were carrying on the work, building spaces, creating community, surviving. Thomas and William stayed home most nights. But they knew the world was still out there, still turning, still resisting. In December, Thomas saw Jacob on the street. They had not spoken in over a year. Jacob looked better, healthier. He smiled when he saw Thomas. He said, "How are you?" Thomas said, "Good. You?" Jacob said, "Better. I left the city for a while, went to Boston, but I came back. I could not stay away." Thomas said, "I understand." Jacob said, "Are you still with William?" Thomas said, "Yes." Jacob said, "Good. You two give me hope." Thomas said, "Hope for what?" Jacob said, "That it is possible to build something, to last." Thomas said, "It is possible. It is just hard." Jacob said, "Everything worth doing is hard." They parted ways. Thomas walked home through cold streets. Snow was starting to fall. The city was quiet. Gas lamps flickered. Horse-drawn carriages rattled past. Everything looked the same as it had 10 years ago. But Thomas was different. He was no longer the terrified 23-year-old who had walked into the Lafayette for the first time. He was someone who had survived, someone who had built a life, someone who had refused to disappear. When he got home, William was already in bed. Thomas undressed and climbed in beside him. William rolled over and put his arm around Thomas. They lay together in the dark. William said, "Where were you?" Thomas said, "Just walking, thinking." William said, "About what?" Thomas said, "About how far we have come." William said, "We have survived." Thomas said, "More than survived. We have lived." William said, "We have." They fell asleep like that, holding each other, in a small apartment on Orchard Street, in a city that wanted them erased, in a world that called them sinners and criminals and degenerates. But they were none of those things. They were just two men who loved each other. And that was enough. The bathhouses of Gilded Age New York were never just about sex. They were never just about forbidden pleasure. They were about community. They were about survival. They were about creating spaces where men who had no word for what they were could find each other, could recognize each other, could exist. The police raided them. The courts convicted the men who went there. Society condemned them, but the bathhouses kept opening. The men kept coming, because they had nowhere else to go. Thomas Byrne was one of those men. He was not famous. He was not important. He was just a clerk who worked at a shipping company and lived in a small apartment with the man he loved. His name does not appear in history books. There are no photographs of him, no letters preserved, no record of his existence except for 2 brief mentions in arrest ledgers. But he was here. He walked into the Lafayette in February of 1880. He kept showing up for the next 10 years, Through raids and arrests and fear and loss, he showed up, he existed, he refused to disappear, and so did thousands of others. Men whose names we will never know, men who loved in secret, men who built community in basements and backrooms and hidden corners of the city, men who were arrested and beaten and erased from history, but who existed anyway. If this story stayed with you, the like button helps the channel reach others who would love it too. Tonight, as you drift off to sleep, spare a thought for Thomas and William and Arthur and Michael and Edward and Henry and Paul and Isaac and Jacob and Stella and all the men who walked down those basement stairs knowing they might not walk back up. Spare a thought for the men who built bathhouses knowing they would be raided. Spare a thought for the community that fractured and reformed and survived against impossible odds. They had no parades, no flags, no legal protections, no social acceptance. They had only each other. And that was enough. May your dreams be free of raids and arrests and the constant fear of being erased. May you sleep knowing that the men who came before you survived so that you could exist. May you wake tomorrow grateful that you live in a world where you can say their names out loud. Good night, and sleep well.